welcome back to Virtual Storytime.
Yes, this week we are talking about groundhogs. February 2nd is Groundhog Day, and on that day, the groundhog will poke its head up out of its hole and...
If it sees its shadow, there are 6 more weeks of winter, and if it doesn't, then we have an early spring.
Which is very exciting, especially in other places besides Florida where they really want it to be springtime. So we've got some really great groundhog stories for you and a super fun puppet show, so stay tuned.
Bye.
So we are going to start with a book called A Garden for Groundhog. The O'Learys had a bit of a farm, a small cottage for the 2 of them and their cat. What's a cat say? Meow. A tiny shed for the goat, the lamb, and 2 chickens, and a tiny little garden with an apple tree. It wasn't much of a farm, but it was big enough, and it belonged to them. There was also a groundhog. He didn't belong to anyone, just himself. He lived in a burrow under the apple tree. That's a nice place to live. Mrs. O'Leary spent the winter spinning and knitting and cooking delicious meals from the food they had grown in the garden the summer before. They ate zucchini squash soup with egg dumplings, zucchini bread with goat cheese and pickled beets, zucchini casserole with potatoes, peas and beans, zucchini salad with yogurt, cabbage and tomatoes, and zucchini carrot cake. That's a lot of zucchini, isn't it? Mr. O'Leary spent the winter reading seed catalogs and repairing the garden tools. The cat spent the winter curled up by the wood stove or stretched out on the sunny windowsill. That's what cats are supposed to do. Lucky cat. The goat, the lamb, and the chickens spent the winter giving milk, growing wool, and laying eggs. That's what goats, lambs, and chickens are supposed to do. The groundhog spent the winter hibernating in his burrow, and that is what groundhogs are supposed to do. It looks very cozy. Along about February, everyone began feeling restless. Mrs. O'Leary had used up all of the wool. Mr. O'Leary had ordered the garden seeds, and the cat dreamed of chasing mice in the fields. The goat, the lamb, and the chickens longed to kick up their heels in the grass. The groundhog was feeling twinges of hunger. He hadn't eaten anything all winter. He wasn't supposed to. Tomorrow is Groundhog Day, said Mr. O'Leary. We must watch for him in the morning. If he comes out and sees a shadow, it will frighten him and he will go back to bed. That will mean 6 more weeks of winter. If he doesn't see a shadow, he will stay awake. Then spring will be early and we can plant our garden sooner. Such foolishness. When that groundhog comes out of his hole, it's the only to see if we have planted anything yet. After all of our work, he ate more from our garden last summer than we did, said Mrs. O'Leary. That's what groundhogs are supposed to do, my dear. They eat all summer so they can sleep all winter. We must allow him some food in exchange for his help in forecasting the weather. I have a plan that will ensure he eats only what we want him to eat this summer, said Mr. O'Leary. Ooh, that sounds like a neat plan. Let's see. Groundhog found Mr. and Mrs. O'Leary waiting and watching under the apple tree. The groundhog stirred himself and waddled out into the sunshine to see if the O'Leary's garden was planted yet. When he realized it wasn't, he tottered back to bed, just as he was supposed to. The winter continued and everyone waited. Ooh, that looks cold. Eventually, spring arrived, just the way it was supposed to. Mr. and Mrs. O'Leary planted their garden. The cat chased mice, the goat, the lamb, and the chickens kicked up their heels in the grass. The groundhog nibbled alfalfa and dandelions, waiting. What do you think the groundhog was waiting for? Mr. and Mrs. O'Leary weeded, watered, hoed, and fussed. That's what gardeners are supposed to do. Their garden looks lovely. The garden grew just as it was supposed to, and it was beautiful. There were plump red tomatoes, sweet juicy melons, tender peas and beans, crisp carrots, big round cabbages, onions, potatoes, beets, and berries, all for the O'Learys. And the zucchini squash was for the groundhog. But groundhogs can't read. They're not supposed to. The end.
And I'm going to read you a story called Go to Sleep, Groundhog. Groundhog went to bed on Columbus Day just like he always did. He brushed his teeth. Always a good thing to do before bed. He put on his jammies. He set his clock for February 2nd. Then he curled up in his warm, cozy bed. He closed his eyes. He tossed and turned, but he couldn't get to sleep. Finally, he got out of bed. He peered at his clock, 1/2 October. Groundhog poked his nose outside his burrow. The moon was full. I'll just go for a little walk, he said. Maybe that will make me sleepy. Groundhog went outside. He saw things he'd never seen before. Raggedy scarecrows and grinning jack-o'-lanterns. Children dressed up like pirates, cowboys, and princesses. What holiday is he seeing? It's Halloween, of course. Halloween witch flew down. What are you doing up? She said. It's almost winter. You should be in bed. Witch flew Groundhog home on her broomstick. She tucked him in. She read him a ghost story. She gave him a glass of apple cider. Groundhog curled up in his warm, cozy bed. He closed his eyes. He tossed and turned, but he couldn't get to sleep. Finally, he got out of bed. He peered at his clock. 1/2 November. He poked his nose outside his burrow. The leaves were red and yellow. I'll just go for a little walk, he said. Maybe that will make me sleepy. What do you think he's going to see in November? Groundhog went outside. He saw things he'd never seen before. Tall yellow corn stalks and round orange pumpkins. Turkeys gobbling in the barnyard. Gobble, gobble. What are you doing up? Turkey said. It's almost winter. You should be in bed, and I should be making myself scarce. Turkey took Groundhog home. He tucked him in. He read him a story about pilgrims. He gave him a slice of pumpkin pie. Groundhog curled up in his warm, cozy bed. He closed his eyes. He tossed and turned, but he couldn't get to sleep. Finally, he got out of bed. He peered at his clock. 1/2 December. Groundhog poked his nose outside his burrow. Stars twinkled overhead. I'll just go for a little walk, he said. Maybe that will make me sleepy. Who's sitting on his tree there? Is that an owl? What do they say? They go, hoo, hoo. Groundhog went outside. He saw things he'd never seen before. Colored lights glowing on some houses, candles shining in windows, holly wreaths hanging on doors. He heard sleigh bells chiming in the air. Santa flew down in his sleigh. What are you doing up? Santa said. It's winter. You should be in bed. Santa took Groundhog home in his sleigh. He tucked him in. He read him a Christmas story. He gave him a glass of milk and a cookie. Groundhog curled up in his warm, cozy bed. He closed his eyes. He didn't toss and he didn't turn. Soon he fell asleep. Bring! Groundhog opened one eye. It can't be time to get up yet, he grumbled. I just got to sleep. Bring! He peered at his clock. February 2nd. Groundhog yawned and stretched. He tumbled out of his burrow. Snow glittered on the ground. The sun was out. The sky was blue. Groundhog saw his shadow. What am I doing up? He said. There are 6 more weeks of winter coming. I should be in bed. He hurried back inside. He ate a bedtime snack. He read himself a bedtime story. Then he tucked himself into his warm, cozy bed, and he pulled up the covers, closed his eyes, and went to sleep. The end. The day before Groundhog Day, Groundhog woke up sick. His muscles ached and his throat hurt. Groundhog felt so awful he went to see Dr. Owl. "You have a bad case of the flu, you do," said Dr. Owl. "You need hot clover soup and bed rest for 2 days." "How many?" asked Groundhog. Two, hooted Dr. Owl. But Groundhog Day was tomorrow. Groundhog couldn't let everyone down because he was too sick to do his job. He tried to think of something.
On his way home to bed, Groundhog passed the Hidey Hole Diner. He saw ads from all the neighborhood animals tacked to a nearby tree. Skunk was looking for a roommate again. Mr. and Mrs. Duck were returning north and had their nest for rent. I know what I'll do, Groundhog thought. I'll advertise for a substitute groundhog.
By 10 o'clock, a line of animals waited to try out. "Achoo! Great," said Groundhog with a sneeze. "Surely one of you could do Groundhog Day for me." Mole was first. "You have to go down in my hole," Groundhog told Mole. "It's pretty dark down there." "No problem," said Mole. "My own hole is even darker."
Mole got comfortable underground. "Now come up and look for your shadow," Groundhog shouted. Mole peeked over the edge. His little eyes squinted. "Well, Mole, what do you see?" Mole spoke to a tree. "Is that you, Groundhog?" Groundhog blew his nose. "This won't work. I need someone who sees well." "I can see well," said a voice from high overhead. Groundhog looked up and saw Eagle.
Eagle swooped down. "From that mountain ledge, Groundhog, I could see a bit of owl feather stuck in your fur. I'd say you have been to see Dr. Owl recently." "Wow! Then surely you will have no trouble seeing your shadow," said Groundhog. "Climb down in the hole and let's practice." "Climb down?" said Eagle. He looked at the entrance to the hole. "Will there be room down there to stretch my wings?" He stretched them wide, very wide. Groundhog rubbed his scratchy throat. "This won't work. I need someone who sees well and isn't bothered by small spaces."
Bear stepped up next. "My own cave is snug and cozy." "Great," said Groundhog. "Climbed out and let's practice." "This is perfect," yelled Bear from the hole. "It's even more comfy than my own cave." "Come out and take a look," called Groundhog. There was no answer. Groundhog poked his head below ground. "Bear, come look for your shadow."
The only answer was a deep, slow snore. Groundhog was frustrated. He needed a substitute who could see well, wasn't bothered by small spaces, and wouldn't fall asleep. I can do it! Let me try!" Squirrel bounced to the front of the line. "Okay," said Groundhog. "Go down to the hole, come back up and look for your shadow." Squirrel leaped in. Whee!
Then she popped her head back up. Groundhog said, "See your shadow?" "Oh, I forgot to look." Down she went. She popped back up. She dropped back down. "I keep forgetting to look," Squirrel giggled. She popped up and down some more. "This is fun," she said. But what Groundhog needed was someone who would pop up and stay up.
By now, Groundhog was feeling even worse. He thought of his warm bed. Was he ever going to find a substitute? "Howdy there, Groundhog. How about giving me a chance?" Up stepped a strange-looking creature. "My name is Armadillo," she said. "You're not from around here, are you?" asked Groundhog. "Nope, I'm from Texas, visiting my cousin Badger," she said. "But I can do this job. I live in a hole. I like small spaces. I see my shadow just fine, and I will pop up and stay up."
Groundhog wasn't so sure. Armadillo climbed down into Groundhog's hole. She poked her head up and looked around. Sure enough, she saw her shadow. "If that happens tomorrow, tell folks the winter will drag on," said Groundhog. "But if you don't see your shadow tomorrow, spring will come early." "Got it," said Armadillo.
"I think you're just the substitute I've been looking for," said Groundhog. "You're hired." "Thanks," said Armadillo. They shook paws. Then Groundhog climbed down his hole into bed. He sipped warm clover soup. He plumped his pillows and tucked his sore self under the flannel quilt.
The next morning, the animals gathered early to hear what Armadillo would say. It was cold and crisp as the sun peeked over the forest. Badger served hot chocolate. Squirrel bounced and cheered for Armadillo. Eagle flew high above in the trees. Muddy Mole looked sleepy, and Bear was still in bed. The animals grew quiet as Armadillo poked her head up and carefully looked around. There on the ground, she saw the shadow of her tiny ears and pointy nose. 6 more weeks of winter, she announced.
Armadillo dropped back into Groundhog's hole. Did you hear that, Groundhog? 6 more weeks of winter. Groundhog groaned from his bed. Ugh. How you feeling, Groundhog? Armadillo asked. A little better, but I'd feel a lot better if it was spring already, Groundhog said. Spring already, said Armadillo. Say, that gives me an idea.
Armadillo found Groundhog's suitcase. Get your gear together, Groundhog, she said. It's already spring in Texas. You can come home with me. Really? Said Groundhog. He imagined himself rolling in warm grass instead of sneezing through 6 more weeks of cold. You bet, said Armadillo. Groundhog jumped from his bed. He grabbed his teddy bear and his toothbrush and tossed them into his suitcase.
I've always wanted to see Texas. Do you think they have cowboy hats in my size? Asked Groundhog. Sure as Texas has a lone star, said Armadillo. Together they walked through the old forest to the bus station, and their shadows followed them all the way there.
The end. Hello and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed those fun Groundhog stories we told you.
Definitely. So we also have a really super cute groundhog craft this week that Miss Cammie has made. The instruction video will go up for that tomorrow. I know that we're open only for curbside right now, but that doesn't mean that you can't come pick up your craft supplies. And you don't even have to have a library card. You don't have to do anything. Just pull up, call us, and say, I would like a groundhog craft, please. And we will bring it out to your car so you can make your very own super cute groundhog.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.